Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I want to introduce the next speaker, Jonathan Roth. Over the last 2 decades, Jonathan has conducted and produced interviews on CTV, OMNI TV, Biography TV, and now for his own production company with men and women shaping our world. Prime ministers, presidents, royalties, business moguls, military commanders, geostrategists, and superstar economists. The topic of Jonathan Roth's talk today is America's Second Civil War. And I recall that his first talk here at Capitalism and Morality went viral and was watched by close to 500,000 people. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jonathan Roth.
All right, thank you. How is this? You can hear me okay with this? Let me try this. All right, well, I want all of you to imagine that you are in a location in the middle of the Middle East, and it's 500 years before the birth of Christ. Wait till that goes by, and then we'll just play imagination here for a moment. So it's 500 years before the birth of Christ, and you're in Babylon, you're rich, and you're at a party at the king's palace, okay? And it's amazing. There's thousands of Babylonian nobles, there's wives running around, concubines, like everything. The spread is incredible. Babylon is at the height of its power at this point in time, and it's believed no one can challenge them economically or militarily. And the party that you're at, it's in one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. This is, in today's vernacular, this party is fully lit. The host of this roaring party, King Belshazzar. He's 40 years old, good looking, and he's in his element. After all, he's hanging out with his nobles who are kissing his rear end a fair bit. There's a lot of wine and there's a lot of women. He's having a great time. And the party is absolutely roaring when he decides that he wants more wine, but this time he wants to drink it out of goblets that his father, King Nebuchadnezzar, had taken from the first temple built in Jerusalem. So he gets the servants to bring the goblets out to him and all of everyone in the banquet hall to have a party, and they pour the wine in the goblets, and they all begin drinking. And as they're drinking, they're praising the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Now, they're having a really good time, and right about the moment that they've all finished their first glass of wine in these goblets, over in the corner of the banquet hall, above a lampstand, a flickering lampstand, these weird hands appear. And the hands start to write on the wall, okay? And the words on the wall spell out, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. Belshazzar, he freaks out when he sees this, and he demands to know what the words mean. And of course, no one knows what they mean. He calls in all his wise men. Nobody has an answer for this. But then the king's mother, this is Nebuchadnezzar's wife, Belshazzar's mother, she hears all the commotion, and she comes out, and she says, look, I think I might know someone that can help. Your old man, he had this guy who could divine dreams and figure out all kinds of stuff. His name's Daniel. Why don't we get him? Maybe he can figure out what these words mean. So they find Daniel, and he shows up. And Daniel says, yes, I'll definitely translate what Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin means. He says, Mene means God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel means you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Parsin, your kingdom is to be divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So the same way that I want you to imagine that you were in that banquet hall 500 years before the birth of Christ, right now we're sitting in somewhat of a hall right now, and to a certain extent, we're sitting in a very similar situation as we look out and take a look at our continent right now. I want to thank you for having me here today. As you had mentioned, Jan, 6 years ago, I came here and gave a talk that was titled Civil War Coming to America with a question mark at the end. I don't think at this point now, if we talk about civil war, that the question mark would be there. The trajectory the U.S. where it's going, especially after this week. It's kind of baked into the cake. So, as I said, this Civil War zeitgeist, it's going on everywhere. And just last month, I don't know if any of you caught it, but billionaire investor Ray Dalio, he's worth $15 billion, one of the greatest hedge fund managers in Wall Street history. He said, quote, this is to the Financial Times in an interview, he said that the U.S. is, quote, on the brink of a civil war, and he added that there's a 35 to 40% chance of it happening. Earlier in May, the Canadian University professor Gad Saad, you might know him as the author of The Parasitic Mind, a fantastic mind if you've ever run into him before online. He put something out on Twitter and he wrote, "War is coming," and then he followed that up by writing, "Some imbeciles are questioning the scope of this prediction, so let me be clear. Civil war is coming to the West." And then Elon Musk put an exclamation mark on it and he said, he typed this out on his phone or his keyboard, wherever he happened to be, he wrote out 100% probability. So the richest man in the world confirmed, basically, agreed with Gad Saad saying, civil war is coming. You know there are articles about civil war happening potentially in the U.S. They're coming out almost literally every day now in the mainstream media. There's no secret now in terms of what's going on. The Atlantic, Newsweek, the Daily Mail, and NPR are just a few just within the last 3 days that have had articles about this. And even Hollywood's getting into the act. I don't know if any of you have seen this movie that just came out within the last couple of months called Civil War. It's a really interesting film. There's a lot of really bad language in it. I watched it with my 16-year-old and it was kind of like, whoa, this movie's, there's a lot of bad words in this movie. But what I will say is the backdrop of the film is that the U.S. is in the midst of civil war, and I think it does give a pretty good picture of what the situation could be like. Now, everyone has an opinion about civil war, whereas before, I'd say 5-6 years ago, there were a lot of people that wouldn't even touch the subject. Just yesterday, Stephen A. Smith, this tells you to what degree this Civil War consciousness has seeped into American culture. Just yesterday, Stephen A. Smith, he's an NBA analyst. In my opinion, he's probably the best NBA analyst. And he said this on his NBA podcast. And he said, quote, "I'm scared as hell. It all points to a civil war in this country. We're all pawns. We're all subject to the mercy of politicians who find a way to manipulate the system and ultimately manipulate us." And he was referring to this Trump verdict that happened in Manhattan on Thursday, where he was guilty of 34 counts. In my opinion, there's no question that May 30th, 2024 is definitely a turning point in U.S. history and maybe world history. We're going to find out here over the next little while. But never before has a U.S. president been a convicted felon, as you all know. And I think if anyone's being honest about it, the game was rigged against him. There was not a chance he was going to walk out of that courtroom a free man in terms of not being convicted. And I will say that what's coming up here soon with the sentencing, I'd bet any amount of money he's going to prison. There's no question that they've played this game this hard. Why would they stop now? They're not stopping now. The game was to get him out of the game, and that's where my guess is that that's where it's going. In fact, this whole justice system in the U.S., it is clearly rigged. I don't know if any of you know this, but according to Pew Research, in 2022, I couldn't even believe this statistic. I had to double check it. Fewer than 1% of federal criminal defendants in the United States were acquitted in 2022, a 99% conviction rate. So, I mean, it's astounding. So the feeling that I had, and maybe many of you can identify with this, when I heard the news of what was going down with Trump's conviction, not that I'm not a Trump supporter, I'm a Canadian, but I had this dread that was kind of just sitting, thinking that, okay, this is happening. They're going to do this. And it was a very similar feeling to what I had when I was in Washington, D.C. in 2017 for Trump's inauguration, because one of my clients was very connected to the Republican establishment. So I had gone there for the inauguration, and honestly, I was shocked by what was happening. I had never been to a U.S. inauguration of a president. I assumed that it would be a really fun, happy event. And I showed up there, and the whole thing was protests everywhere, and violence, and cars on fire, and Eventually, I retreated to my hotel room at the end of the day, and that night, all I heard were sirens and helicopters flying overhead and yelling and screaming outside of the hotel. I was about 5 or 6 blocks from the White House, and I came away from that experience really shaken up about what had happened there, and I related in the talk that I had given soon after here. But it's kind of the same feeling that I had on Thursday when this decision came down, because it's just this realization that, okay, they're going down this road. This is the path that they're on, and I guess we've known that they're on this path for a while, right? This political polarization is going on, but this is a whole new level of polarization, and I do think that we all know, and maybe some of us even feel this, that's what's happening now cannot continue without something breaking, given what's going on. It just can't continue without something breaking. And a dangerous signal for me that I think very few people at the time even may have picked up on, that's just been ringing alarm bells in my head ever since, is if you remember in February of 2020, Trump gave his last State of the Union address. And when he finished the address, behind him, Nancy Pelosi took the pages from the State of the Union, and she started ripping it up behind him as he was, taking in the adulation of at least half the Congress. She's ripping it up behind him, and she talked about it in a book that just recently came out. The book is titled "Madam Speaker, Nancy Pelosi and the Lessons of Power." And Pelosi said, quote, she said she felt liberated. He was shredding the truth, so she is going to shed she would then shred his speech. So several very serious people, a couple in particular, are already at this stage of the game calling for tit for tat, that basically these red states need to retaliate in terms of what just happened to Trump. They need to do it to Democratic politicians. One is Megyn Kelly, who's a lawyer. She's formerly on Fox News, but she's got a huge following, huge podcast. She's a very smart legal analyst, and she made no bones about it that the Republicans needed to play the same game against Democrats. And then the one that really surprised me was John Yoo, who was a Bush administration lawyer. He publicly came out and wrote an article and basically said the only way to stop the Democrats and stop this nonsense is we have to play the same game. Somehow thinking that if you do the same thing they're doing, that you're both going to decide, well, we have to stop doing it. So 2 days ago, the Wall Street Journal's Peggy Noonan, who's probably one of the last esteemed op-ed writers in the United States, penned an op-ed titled, "We Are Starting to Enjoy the Hatred." And this is some of what she wrote. Normally in a column like this, you give a suggestion or two on how to turn things around. And I don't know, but I suppose it at least starts with understanding that the people we're so harshly judging are our countrymen. They share the country with you. We have to go forward into the future together, because if we don't, we won't have a future. We have to ease up, we have to slow down. Our desire to look down, we just have to stop it. We have to be a little more generous. We have to stop enjoying our hate so much, and we'll have to come up with thoughts that are definitely better than that, because we can't go on indefinitely like this. She's basically enunciating, putting into words what I think we all feel. So Monica Duffy Tuft is probably one of the world's top experts in civil wars. And in 2021, she wrote a really fascinating article that happened after all the riots that happened on January 6th for Foreign Policy, which is the U.S. top, more of an academic journal that covers foreign affairs. And the article was titled, "How Civil Wars Start, 3 Factors Come into Play, and the U.S. Demonstrates All of Them." And these were the 3 factors that she highlighted. She said, most civil wars have 3 features in common. The first, most civil wars follow some prior conflict. So there must be an issue from the past that is used to fuel this discontent. Well, we already know that what happened in the first Civil War has been constantly brought up decade after decade as something to try to fuel discontent. But clearly race over the last decade has been brought up to really fuel discontent in the United States. Second, she said, national identity needs to be divided along some critical axes such as race, faith, or class. So, just take a look at the US, that's clearly happening. And then third, she said this, you can have the first two, but she said you must have the third. And I think we have the third now. She said the third is, there must be a shift from tribalism to sectarianism. With tribalism, people begin to seriously doubt whether other groups in their country have the larger community's best interests at heart. In sectarian environments, though, economic, social, and political elites and those they represent come to believe that anyone who disagrees with them is evil and actively working to destroy the community. Enemies of the state come to displace the loyal opposition. And there is no question that on both sides of the aisle, this is the rhetoric that you're hearing. I would say also in the US, you have something else that's going on, and it's been going on for quite a while, but it's accelerating, and is really, I feel like it's accelerated in this last couple of years since basically COVID. There's this huge change that's happening in the US, it's also happening in the Western world, as it pertains to religion. Christianity is being completely jettisoned in exchange for some nebulous form of spiritual belief or secularism. It's this weird mashup of the two. Just to give you a kind of some really statistics around it, in the 1990s, roughly 90% of Americans said they were Christians. Today, that's around 60%. 15% of Americans attend religious services each week, and those numbers are dramatically dropping, as in like it was 18% last year, it's 15% this year, and among young people it's completely collapsed. The fastest growing religious group in America are the nones. You might have heard this before, those who are agnostic or atheists. Now many of you might say, well, who cares? Does this really matter? And I would say, this is what I would argue, is that it absolutely matters, okay? This loss of faith, and it's happening, like I said, across the West, is a sign of very dangerous things to come, because culture is downstream of religion, and politics is downstream from culture. Religion is the building block of civilization. It doesn't matter where you want to talk about, religion is where it all starts. So basically, can you have a civilization that's built on something you don't necessarily believe in anymore? This is about a couple of years ago. There was a really interesting interview that I listened to between the journalist Andrew Sullivan and the political scientist Charles Murray. Charles Murray is a really fascinating, interesting guy. Murray said something so profound in this interview. I was in the car. I had to stop it and hit the back thing and listen to it again. And this is what he said. He said that we're about to find out, the world is about to find out, if we can have the West without Christianity. In other words, can we have Western civilization without Christianity? And Murray said, I don't think we can. And I would actually tend to agree with him. Now, a sidebar story about this, and Doug Casey actually has mentioned this several times, and I think it's very prescient the way he talks about it. And we're already seeing it happen in Europe. But this loss of faith is leaving this huge gaping hole in people's lives, especially in the lives of young men, okay? Especially the lives of young men. And I would argue that especially what we're seeing in Europe, that some sort of form of Islam is going to start to creep in there. And that is why I think there were many of us that were kind of surprised. If you remember when Andrew Tate came on the scene, all right? Andrew Tate, if no one knows, he's like the biggest social influencer that there is for young men in the world, despite being banned from every social media platform. And I had never heard of this guy before. And all of a sudden we get this notice home from my kid's school, and the notice is, FYI, you need to be aware that your sons are listening to and talking about this Andrew Tate character, and you need to look into him. And I was like, who the heck is Andrew Tate? And then all three of my sons, my teenage sons, proceed to fill me in because they were experts in Andrew Tate, and I had no idea. Well, Andrew Tate is a Muslim. He converted to Islam. And my guess, this is just my guess, is that someone somewhere realized this guy has such an enormous following of young men. If he were to all of a sudden channel all of that energy, because he says a lot of interesting things that poke at kind of the a lot of the nonsense, quite frankly, that's going on, especially in Western culture, if he decides to channel all of those young men towards Islam, that's my guess as to why all of a sudden he was banned, okay? Because he was all of a sudden banned, and yet he still remains incredibly popular. So extrapolate this, going back to the US, extrapolate this loss of religion as a whole, and what you see replacing it is confusion everywhere, right? On just about every front you see confusion. Social policy, nobody's getting married anymore. Nobody's having kids anymore. And if you don't have kids, who transmits the civilizational values on? Nobody does. Because if you don't have kids, you can't. And interestingly enough, studies have shown that fertility rates are directly connected to religious affiliation. The more you attend a religious service, the more likely you are to have enough children to replace you and your spouse. Rod Dreher, who's a fascinating commentator on the current societal upheaval that's going on in the US and in Europe, he wrote the bestseller called Live Not by Lies. It came out a couple of years ago, sold hundreds of thousands of copies. He wrote something recently that I found just super interesting. He said 9 years ago, a political scientist told Dreher, that he had recently completed a government-funded study seeking ways to make fertility rise absent religious belief. And he found that there are no historical examples where that has taken place. So in other words, if you remove religion out of the equation, what's the point of reproducing? What's the point other than, frankly, seeking pleasure in life, and that's it? So because no one's having children in the US is needing to import people from elsewhere. And we can get into all the problems that happen along those lines. Look, in small doses, I think it works in any civilization. But at scale, if you bring in millions of people from other civilizations into your own, you're going to start to have problems. Anyone who looks at the data with any sort of impartiality, I think, would come to that conclusion. And here's the bigger issue as it pertains to the US, especially over the last 3.5 years. We have this phenomenon where literally millions of people have crossed into the US, whether they're being facilitated by the US government with the US government's eyes closed or one hand tied behind its back. Who knows? We do know that US government money is helping to bring people illegally across the border, the southern border, into the United States, and people flying from all over the world to Ecuador mainly, and then making their way up the migrant path to try to get into the United States. So there's been this is their official numbers, there's been 8.7 million migrant encounters since Biden took office, which translates into at least 10 million plus coming over. That's what they think. And all of these people, they don't know who they are. I guess they do. They've apparently been given phones and given some sort of a social security number. But the issue is that they're literally just dumping people into the US, which causes all kinds of social mayhem all over the place. As you know, everything else is in the midst of being redefined, from what a man and a woman can be, or who they can be, or who can say that they're a man or a woman, but also people, depending on your race, that depends on what you can get hired for. This is where things are going. And at the same time, we have crime completely out of control in major US cities. You've seen just this week, Boston's mayor has decided that she wants to advocate for turning Boston into San Francisco. For some reason, she's pushing a new policy that won't prosecute criminals for theft and abolishes the gang registry. So I see things like this and I say to myself, why would she do this? Why would someone running a city actively say, no, we're not going to prosecute you if you try to steal something out of a store, and we're going to get rid of the gang registry so the gangs can run wild? And I would say because her values are literally upside down. But the crazy part is the city voted for her. The voters voted for that. That is what they actually voted for. The country is literally coming apart. So here's the thing, is the US on the verge of a real civil conflict that involves widespread war-like violence. As I mentioned before, the interview that Financial Times did with Ray Dalio, he said that the likelihood of civil war is somewhere around 40%, but the civil war that Dalio envisions is not necessarily one where people grab guns and start shooting. That's a quote. He said he does not see it where you're going to grab guns and start shooting. Instead, in this civil war, quote, people move to different states that are more aligned with what they want, and they don't follow the decisions of federal authorities of the opposite political persuasion. Well, we're already seeing this now, right? We saw it start during COVID, people moving from California to Texas or to Florida. Are Dems moving to California or Colorado? I don't know, maybe they are. I think California, up until last year, had a net migration out, and now this past year was the first one where it was positive. Whether that's because of all the immigrants that are coming into the US, we don't know. But look, it's clear that red states, and Texas is leading the way, have decided to push back against some of these edicts that the federal government is doing. Now, I don't know if any of you saw this in January. When I first read this, I thought this is a clear sign that the US is headed for some sort of a split here. The Biden administration took the state of Texas to court because essentially the governor of Texas said, look, we're having all of these illegals, migrants, whatever term you want to use, these people coming across the border illegally. They're causing mayhem all over our state, and we need to do something about it. So he got the National Guard out there to put razor wire at the border to try to stop this. And it was stopping it. But the federal government stepped in and said, no, we're going to sue you because that's our jurisdiction, not yours. And of course, Abbott's saying, well, you're not doing your job, we have to do it. Well, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 against the state of Texas, saying they had to take down the razor wire and basically do what the federal government wanted. And the state of Texas said, up yours. And to this day, the razor wire is still there. They've actually extended it across the entire state. And the state is basically saying, we don't care that the Supreme Court ruled against us. We're going to do whatever we want. So in other words, let's just call a spade, whether you agree with what the state of Texas is doing or you don't, what it actually means is the respect for the rule of law is not great, okay? When one of the most populous and frankly economically powerful states in the union is saying we're not going to follow the decision of the Supreme Court, especially if we don't like it, I would argue that that's a pretty bad sign. So look, Dalio is right so far. He's saying the political civil war that's manifesting in Americans, it's not translating into violence, and people are definitely moving to states where they feel most politically comfortable. Well, this said, that Peggy Noonan article that I referenced earlier in the Wall Street Journal from just a couple of days back, she also wrote this. She wrote, people prattle about a coming civil war. I love the term prattle. People prattle about a coming civil war. But what are they talking about? Neither side is going to raise an army and fight in the streets. The most Trump-supporting state in the country is not going to fire a Fort Sumter. And even if anything like that happened, who gets custody of the nuclear arsenal? Who's left sending out the Social Security checks? There's a general disbelief that things could go kinetic. Michael Vlahos is a former professor at the U.S. Naval War College. He's a professor now at Johns Hopkins. He's former State Department, former CIA. And he wrote this stunning piece that you can find on the internet. It was published in 2018 after I gave my talk. And it is called We Were Made for Civil War. He wrote it for the American Conservative. And in the piece, this is what he writes. He says, disbelieving war makes it inevitable. People will always disbelieve that we could come to blows until we do. Delegates at the Democracy Party convention in Charleston in the summer of 1860 were still in denial of the coming fury. In other words, just because you believe it can happen, once you start believing it can happen, there's a very good chance that it could. So as I said back in 2018, whether the US ends up in another hot civil war is up to them. The Americans are going to have to decide. But there are enormous global events taking place that may overwhelm any internal national split that happens in the United States, at least temporarily. This is my premise here. The world's on the precipice of global war, and I think all of us know it if we take a look around at what's going on. Ian Bremmer, who's the top geopolitical analyst in the world this week, said on his Twitter, you can go find it yourself, Macron and Biden will announce military trainers in Ukraine during D-Day celebrations in France on June the 8th. The Russians have been saying publicly for a couple of months already that there are already troops from NATO on the ground in Ukraine operating heavy weapons, hitting Russian targets both in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine. Ukraine last week, or was it 2 weeks ago, I think it was last week, Ukraine took out a radar system integral to Russia's strategic nuclear weapons arsenal, which the United States publicly said was exceptionally dangerous. And you have to understand that Russia's strategic nuclear arsenal, strategic nuclear weapons, are the weapons they drop on cities. Tactical nukes are the small ones that they might use in a battlefield to try to, get rid of armies or for tactical reasons. But strategic radar systems for Russia's strategic nuclear capabilities, taking out one of those is, if there was a red line, I would argue that that's probably it. And now, this just came down over the last couple of days, now the US is allowing, and some would say encouraging, Ukraine to use US-made weapons to strike inside Russia. And as a matter of fact, Secretary of State Antony Blinken literally said it publicly, I believe it was yesterday. And this is a red line that the US said could not be crossed. They literally have said this over the last 2 years, that there's not a chance that you would use US weapons to hit targets within Russia. All of a sudden, everything's changed. So you have that going on there. You also have China, Taiwan, the Philippines. There's a ton of tripwires in the Pacific. We all know what they are. In the Middle East, the Red Sea remains a no-go zone. The Houthis continue to hit shipping targets. The US Navy seems impotent in terms of stopping these attacks. Yesterday, it's not exactly, we still don't actually have an answer. Yesterday, the spokesman for the Houthis announced that they had struck the USS Eisenhower aircraft carrier with ballistic and cruise missiles. And initially, the Washington Post reported that a Defense Department official said that everything was fine in the Middle East. Later yesterday, the Washington Post, in the same article, said that now the officials were saying that they were looking into matters in the Middle East. In other words, walking back slightly what had happened. So did the carrier get hit? Are we ever going to know? Something's going on there because the answers were not, let's put it this way. If the carrier was struck, just take a picture of it and post it on the Twitter account for the aircraft carrier. They didn't do that. So that's going on. We also have this, what just happened here, 3-4 weeks ago, where this direct Iranian Israeli tit for tat back and forth, which both sides seem to not want to necessarily engage in, but clearly there's a lot of tension there. Africa is a theater that no one is talking about, but in the last 3 years, there's been 8 coups in Africa, and all of them favoring China and Russia. The Sahel has completely been taken over by the Russians, and China is moving in. Niger is probably the best example, a country that I was in 2016. I was there for a uranium company, and unfortunately, all that uranium now is controlled by Russia. And what was really interesting about that was, and it's going to tie back to what you're seeing in Ukraine, is that France was the colonial power in Niger, and 1 out of every 3 light bulbs in France was powered by uranium, allegedly from Niger. That was always the famous line that the French would use about Niger. The interesting part is that France, as soon as things really went sideways in Niger, France walked away almost immediately, did not engage, and I thought to myself at the time, if Charles de Gaulle was running France, do you really think that he would let some tin pot colonel in the Nigerian army come and take over this country that's strategically so important for them? There's not a chance that that would have happened. Immediately, he went and made deals for uranium in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. But what's very interesting is the Russian Wagner Group was clearly involved in that. And you'll notice that who is the guy that's been saying just saying negative things about the Russians over the last month. Macron has been the main guy saying that the Russians have to stop, we have to get involved, we have to send people there. He's been the one, and it's clear that the French are not happy about their colonial territories basically being taken from them in Africa. Also, something else that's interesting about Africa, and that's that last year at about this time, the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, was in Zambia, and she spent 3 days in Zambia, which is, we think about it for a second, that's kind of unprecedented for a vice president to spend that much time in a country like Zambia. And the truth is, what I was told was that they were flipping that country, that that's actually what was going on, that they were flipping it from pro-China to pro-US, and all of a sudden you'll see, actually, there seems to be some companies involved there that are definitely American companies, and the Chinese ones are being forced out. We also have this situation in Ghana in South America. There's a huge oil find there. It's been somewhat in the news over the last few weeks, last few months, quite frankly. But basically, Venezuela, backed by the Russians and the Chinese, are threatening to invade a part of Ghana where all the oil production is set to go. I mean, the oil production that's going to come out of Ghana is going to be absolutely enormous. It could go up to like 3 to 4 million barrels a day, ultimately, once it fully gets online. But it is literally the biggest oil project in the world. And the Americans apparently have blanketed the whole country. The American soldiers are in every hotel because they're basically telling the Venezuelans, backed by the Russians and the Chinese, don't interfere here. But it is another theater that all of a sudden the Americans have to worry about. As Axios reported, they reported this earlier this year, never before have we talked to so many top US government officials who in private are worried about so many overseas conflicts at once. So you have the military situation, okay? Then you also have the global economic situation, which is extremely fragile. US debt, we've already heard it here a little bit today. It's completely out of control, $35 trillion in debt. In 2000, it was $5.5 trillion. There's nearly a $2 trillion annual deficit in perpetuity right now in terms of US spending. It's completely out of control. Countries are most definitely de-dollarizing. This is real and it's happening. China divested of US treasuries and sold a record amount in the first quarter. They weaponized the US dollar in terms of taking Russian assets. Like you can argue whether they took it, stole it, whatever you want to say. But by the Americans essentially taking Russian assets denominated in US dollars, what they told the rest of the world was, if you get offside with us, we could potentially take what you own in our currency as well. The Saudis, this is something that wasn't reported very widely, but I think it really tells you a story here. The Saudis sold off 41% of their entire US stock portfolio in the first quarter of this year. Now you tell me why they would do that. The US economy is hitting, this is quote, stall speed right now. That's from economist David Rosenberg, one of the most famous economists in the US. He's based in Toronto. Pending home sales, this is a leading indicator, this tells you where things are at in the US, is at the lowest level since April of 2020 and is lower than the preceding 20 years. April 2020 was obviously COVID, so let's just remove that. But basically, pending home sales, they're at the lowest level that they've been in 20 years. And inflation, the Fed, no matter what they seem to do, they just can't seem to tamp it down, no matter what. So what could tip it all over? There's all kinds of things that could tip everything over economically, but Japan is a country that you need to be watching. Last week, Japanese stocks recorded their largest outflow ever. And as Japan weakens, they may be forced to sell US treasuries, which could send the entire global economic system into chaos. Things are definitely shaky. So how does this all tie back to this fear of a second US civil war? If the US enters into a war directly with Russia and or China, all bets are off. The war is going to be so terrible, who knows what the heck could happen. But if the US were to suffer a major strategic loss in such a conflict, okay, if they really get involved in Ukraine here over the next few weeks and things really get going and the US gets their rear end kicked, it could lead to major civil unrest in the US, and there are many historical examples that you can use, and maybe the best within the last 100 years, well, in the last 120 years, is the Russian-Japanese War in 1905, where basically the Japanese defeated a very confident Russia in a naval battle in the Sea of Japan and ended up killing 5,000 Russian sailors. They captured 6,000 sailors, and 21 Russian ships were sunk. Essentially, the entire Russian fleet was completely destroyed, and this humiliating defeat resulted in the 1905 Russian Revolution, which ultimately, the connections went directly from 1905 to what happened in 1917 when the Tsar was overthrown by the Bolsheviks. So now, I want you to imagine the psychological impact of a US carrier being sunk, okay? There's roughly 6,000 sailors on a US aircraft carrier. They're all dead. You also have the added problem that almost all of the US carriers are nuclear. That's what powers them. You have a nuclear disaster happening at the same time. And just think about that for a second, and also consider that the US despite all the bluster, despite all the talk that they're the most powerful military in the history of the world, they are definitely not prepared for a total war. The manufacturing base is completely not ready, and the army is totally incompetent. And I think we can go through the examples, and you can see the examples are a myriad. They lost in Iraq, the disaster in Afghanistan, the pullout in terms of what happened there and how bad it was, and that nobody got fired, tells you everything you need to know. This $320 million pier that was built off of Gaza that just sunk. It was literally there for 2 weeks, and it just sunk. That's how bad things are within the U.S. military. They literally, and this is another point, this was in Foreign Policy just a couple of weeks ago. Foreign Policy, this was the title of the article. The U.S. Navy can't build ships. Decades of deindustrialization and downsizing have left America without shipyards to build and maintain a fleet. That's how bad things are, okay? I'm not even going to get into the fact that the U.S. doesn't actually have any mineral production that can support weapons production if things really get sideways, because the truth is almost all of the critical minerals that the U.S. needs are controlled by Russia and China. And then there's this added little wrinkle to the story. Our enemies, U.S. enemies, could very well have weapons that the U.S. isn't prepared for. So just a few years ago, I moderated a geopolitical panel that featured Pippa Malmgren, Ian Bremmer, George Friedman, and Ambassador Harold Malmgren. And Harold Malmgren was is this unbelievably fascinating guy. He was an advisor to 4 or 5 U.S. presidents, starting with JFK, LBJ, Nixon. Nixon sent him to Germany and France to tell them, we're going off the gold standard. This is a serious guy. So I'm moderating this panel, and the truth is the panel is kind of boring. And I'm looking at the clock, and we got like 15 minutes left, and I said, you know what, I'm going to light everybody's hair on fire here, get something happening. And Harold and I had had dinner the night before, and he had told me a story at dinner. And I said, Harold, do you mind telling our audience, there's about 1,000 people in the hall, do you mind telling our audience the story? And this is the story he told. He said that in 2014, there was a U.S. missile cruiser that was in the Black Sea. And it has the Aegis weapon system on it, which is the most advanced weapon system the U.S. Navy has on their ships. And all of a sudden, 2 Russian planes fly over at low altitude and have something suspended from the bottom of the airplanes as they fly over this missile cruiser. And all of a sudden, the ship's engines turn off as the first plane turns off, and then the entire weapon system, or sorry, it was reversed. The weapon system turns off first, and then the engines turn off. And the ship is literally drifting in the Black Sea. Well, I guess it scared the pants off the commanding officer of the ship and the crew, because when they returned to the United States, the captain of the ship resigned, and apparently half the crew resigned from the Navy right then and there, because they were like, look, there's nothing you can do to protect us here. Clearly, whatever tech they have, we can't do anything about. And I will remind you, whether this story is true or not, who knows, okay? But there has been a story in the news, if you recall, that Putin was flying in his plane and had some sort of technology, this is just a few months ago, and flew over a U.S. aircraft carrier, and the aircraft carrier turned off. Just go look it up. It's floating around out there. All I know is this story that was literally told by one of the most connected U.S. policymakers of the last 50 years, obviously that story is true. So whether they have this kind of tech, we don't know. All I'm saying is if the U.S. gets involved in a war with Russia or China, they're going to run into tech that they probably haven't seen before. So if there's another major economic disaster, say hyperinflation in the U.S., absolutely, that could also lead to huge civil unrest and civil war. As I mentioned in 2018 in my talk, probably the most influential study on civil war that was ever conducted by 2 Oxford University professors argues that causes for civil wars are primarily economic and not grievance-based. Yes, some conflicts occur because of a loss of power by the dominant majority, okay? But economics are typically the overriding concern. And the economic situation in the United States is clearly grave. It remains fixable, okay? I do think it's fixable, but it's really grave, and somebody needs to move on it right away. How much time do I have? Okay. All right. I'm gonna end with a quick story here. I go to Las Vegas about once a year for a broadcasting convention. And a few years ago, you kind of get tired of the Strip and you want to see other things. Well, if you ever go to Las Vegas, which I'm sure many of you do, you need to go to the National Atomic Testing Museum in Las Vegas. Really fascinating place. There were hundreds of nuclear tests that the US conducted in Nevada, and this museum documents all of them. Well, when you go into the museum, there's this video playing, and I'll never forget, there's this officer that's being interviewed in the video, and this guy laments the fact that the last US nuclear test was in 1992, which means the current generation of policymakers and military officers, none of them have any idea of the destructive power of nuclear weapons because they've never encountered it. Theoretically, they know what it means, but they actually have no idea as to how powerful these things are, and that this unfamiliarity is breeding complacency about nuclear weapons that, frankly, we're seeing it today, right, in terms of what's being talked about. And the same absolutely goes for civil war. There's a lot of talk about it, but I don't think anyone knows or can comprehend how bad it could be. As you remember, in 1994, it does not take very long to kill 1 million people, as the Rwandans proved in just 2 to 3 months. The Chinese Civil War that took place between 1927 and 1949, similar population size of the US, maybe just a little bit larger. Over 15 million people died, and at least that many, probably double or triple that many, were injured, let alone all the psychological damage and everything else. So the reality is that none of us want this. We really hope the Americans can figure out their situation. But here's the thing. In 2006, I interviewed Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, who had turned literally the breadbasket of Africa into the worst hellhole in Africa, where they had to ship in all the food because literally the country was starving to death. And I remember sitting with one of the opposition politicians and a journalist from Zimbabwe saying, why, in my simplistic Western mind, why can't you guys just sit down and figure this out? Because your people are literally starving to death, right? They're all starving to death. And I'll never forget the politician, he said, because the Mugabe regime does not care about the people. They only care about themselves. It's about power, that's it. And I think what we're seeing in the US right now, is definitely that same mentality. So finally, I want to end by basically where I began, this story about Daniel and the writing on the wall. That night, the Belshazzar was told by Daniel what that meant, that basically God's numbered your days of your reign, brought it to an end. You've been weighed on the scales and you've been found wanting, and your kingdom is to be divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. That very night, according to the biblical record, Belshazzar, the king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom. And I would argue for us today, the writing is most definitely on the wall. Thank you.